Hello, my name's Danuta Kean, and this is the last in the current series of French Passions. And this evening I'm going to be discussing Guy de Maupassant with the acclaimed novelist and broadcaster, Kate Mosse. Kate is the author of 2 works of non-fiction and 5 novels. Her third novel, Labyrinth, has been published in 38 languages and in 41 countries, and has sold an astounding 5 million plus copies. It's quite astonishing. And her last 2 novels drew on territory that would have been very familiar to Maupassant. In Sepulchre, part of the story takes place in fin de siècle of Paris, and in The Winter Ghosts, Freddie Watson, an Englishman who's been scarred by the First World War, is haunted by spectres of more than one past. Read it, it's very good. She's currently working on Citadel, which will be the 3rd and final instalment in the Languedoc trilogy, and that will be published next year by Orion. Born in 1850, Guy de Maupassant was a master of the naturalistic school of literature. A protégé of Flaubert, he wrote novels and short stories that by turns shock, entertain and enlighten. And his characters, such as the amoral arriviste George Duroy in Bel-Ami, or the patriotic prostitute of Boule de Suif, are as relevant today as when they first appeared. So welcome, Kate. At the end of this session, we will have a short time, 10 minutes or so, for questions as well. But first of all, Kate.
Hello.
What brought you to Maupassant's work?
Well, I mean, firstly, just to say it's lovely to be here and be part of this series, because I'm sure many of you will have been to some of the others, and it's been a terrific lineup. So I feel rather humbled to be, coming after Edmund de Waal, and we're doing a French Passions together for the proms in a couple of weeks' time. So it's wonderful to be here to do this talk. I have a very strange relationship with Maupassant, as with many of the French writers. At school, how many people here are British or who went through the English education system? Right, well, in which case you know how very badly French is taught in English schools, and how you don't really get introduced to any writers who are not English language writers, and most of those have been dead for a great deal of time. And so I didn't study French beyond O-level, and I didn't therefore start to discover any literature, either in translation or original language in French or German, until I was in my 30s, really. So with Maupassant, it was one of those strange things that I was at university, and there were various plays that all university students did. And they tended to be plays such as Christopher Hampton's Total Eclipse, which is about the relationship between Verlaine and Rimbaud. And there were little snippets of notes in the margin saying, yes, of course, this refers to a story by such and such, and this refers to a play by such and such. And little by little, as I got older, I kept coming across, referenced in other writers' works, this author called Guy de Maupassant. I didn't have, good enough French to read him in French at that point. But finally, when I started to write myself, I wanted to read the best short stories, because you cannot write well if you don't read well. And so everybody said, who should you read? And I read some, I read Catherine Mansfield, various, and none of those quite did it for me. And then I went into a bookshop and bought the Penguin edition, the 1971 Penguin edition, the Roger Collett one, I'm sure many of you have read that, of a collection of short stories, and thought, oh, I see, that's how you write a short story.
And it's interesting you discovered him in translation. How do you feel about the issue of translation? Because some people say we should read it in the original language.
Well, I don't speak any other language apart from English and French, and I have a little bit of this, that and the other. And so if I didn't read work in translation, most of the world's literature would be shut to me. And I would deeply regret not having read Love in the Time of Cholera or War and Peace or whatever else it is. So I don't have any problem with reading in translation, and I don't have any problem with being read in translation. Often people say to me, should I read your books in French or should I read them in English? And it's not quite the same, because if you're lucky, and I am lucky in my French translator, to have someone who is a beautiful writer, and he is, then I feel that the translator improves my work enormously. And I know this when I get to France, and I'm treated with enormous amount of respect, and they ask these questions, and I feel, my God, I'm going to win the Pulitzer Prize or the Orange Prize or whatever in France. And then you go to America, and the only question they ask you is, have you met Dan Brown? So it works both ways. Not that they're translated quite in American, but I feel that there are many very great translators. One of the very first translators that many of us will have known of Maupassant, of course, was Elizabeth Bowen, and you couldn't ask for more than her. So for me, it's not a problem, and I've only more recently read him in French, when my French had improved enough to be able to do it. But my affection, therefore, is for my own discovery in English, actually.
Did you find your relationship with his work change when you read them in the original language?
There's always a different sort of shadow in a text. Whatever the language it's been translated into is. So, and you can see it. So many of you will know Orman Pamuk. He has said that in his English translation is a lot more serious than the books actually are when he wrote them. There are very few people, I think, who successfully translate themselves. The most obvious, given where we are, of course, today, would be Samuel Beckett, who would both write in English and write in French, and had that ability to know that some stories required to be written in French and some in English. And so I think it was the great Harold Bloom that said, the particular book had arrived in this country with a little of its bloom rubbed off. He meant that the translation had flattened it out. I do think, though, that a lot of Maupassant's reputation, and we'll come on to that in certain areas, particularly his attitudes to women, have been enormously and badly influenced by the nature of the earlier translations. And when you read more contemporary translations, there is an equanimity, if you like, which I think is present in the French and absent in the sort of original Penguin classics that many of us read first.
It's because he's hardly a hero of the feminist movement, really. I mean, I find his women are actually quite complex, and my relationship to those women complex as a feminist, because on one level you have very strong women who are dynamic and making decisions, but on another level you have women who are invariably seem to be prostitutes, even if they are very patriotic, or
they've all got jobs
women. Though. They've all got jobs, or they're craven, such as the wife in A Million, who's trying to get pregnant and then has an affair with her husband's colleague. And it's...
Well, you see, we'll obviously talk more specifically about particular bits of work in a moment, but in this general sense, I think that that's a very clear example that the Roger Collett collection of short stories, which was published in 1971, if you like, pre the feminist movement in this country, a lot of the language and indeed the choice of stories, I think gives a false impression of Maupassant's attitude to women, in that I would say that he is equally scathing of men and women and equally warm. And so often you see, for example, in La Mer Sauvage, one of the great sort of war stories, with the woman who's there, and she has billeted on her, these Prussian soldiers, and then she discovers her own son has died, and she burns them alive. This is a pretty extreme horrific piece of revenge. But in that story, for example, there is a great deal of talk about, well, enormously modern talk, really, about working men and women, and how in the end they are done over by the bourgeoisie, by the kings, by the generals. And for me, therefore, he is even-handed in his warmth. Most of the women are not most, there are a great number of women who are prostitutes. There are obviously a lot of silly wives. There are also a lot of very strong women who are doing what needs to be done. And the judgment on those men is as harsh. And I think it's also a great mistake. You know, many people, the one thing that a book I suppose that they might know, if it's not Boule de Suif, you know, that particular nouvelle, they would know Bel Ami, a very well-known novel, perhaps the best known in the general sense of his novels. And there is always a blurring in a reader's mind, if we're not very careful, between the character of Georges and the character of Guy de Maupassant. They, as a writer, it is the most frustrating thing when people say, so you think such and such. And you go, you know what? That's my character that thinks that. This is not necessarily what I think. So, I mean, I feel that there are, more than 300 stories. A very deliberate attempt to include some and not include others. And for those of you who are reading in English rather than French, there is a new, relatively new edition, Sean Miles translated, I think it was about 2004, of stories, I think it's called A Prussian Affair and Other Stories. And I would say that collection gives a more accurate reading of who Maupassant was as a writer and his actual concerns. And I find it a much warmer collection.
And do you have a particular favourite among all his stories? I mean, as you say, 300 stories and was it 6 or 7 novels?
6 novels.
Yeah, 6 novels.
I think there are different stories that I admire or love at different times. So I enormously enjoy the ones that have not just Boule de Suif, but that the ones that have very strongly the background of the Franco-Prussian War, the Commune, the starving of Paris in 1870 and 1871, because I enjoy the historical element of it and the context of what was going on there. So if we think about Boule de Suif, which I imagine many people here will have read, it is staggering when I went back to reread it for this. And I read it in both, just to sort of have it, you know, in left ear, right ear. It is one of the most brilliant pieces of writing about what it means to live under occupation. Now, I only saw that in it this week because the third novel of my Languedoc trilogy, Citadel, is set during the Second World War. And so my eyes were thinking about how would any of us have coped, actually, if we had to make those choices? So then when I went, and I've already mentioned La Mer Sauvage, you go back to that and you think that is written in, you know, the 1880s. That could have been written in 1942, when the Germans crossed the demarcation line into the southwest of France and everything changed for the south. So sometimes it's the historical veracity. Other times I find the staggering imagination, the surreal imagination, very compelling. Obviously, everybody knows La Horla, but for me, I enjoy the ones that are sort of more Edgar Allan Poe-ish, I suppose. So there's a story called Un Lâche, and it's a sort of about a coward, a man who is, you know, sort of terribly upright and wonderful, and he sort of gets involved and he is challenges to a duel, and he's going to do the duel, and he doesn't identify the feelings that he has in himself as he walks around his chamber. Then little by little, he realizes that he's scared. And he's so mortified by understanding that he is scared and therefore that he might be a coward, that he talks and he talks and he talks and he talks, and the last lines of the story are him putting his revolver in his mouth and shooting himself. Now, that is sophisticated psychology. You know, it's like the Edgar Allan Poe story, The Beating Heart, you know. And I would say sort of... there's one that's set quite, you know, a very late story, L'Endormeuse, and it's, I think it's sometimes translated as a lullaby, where it is a dream, and it has the very typical Maupassant framing device. You know, that someone saying, I'm going to tell you the story of something that happened or something that I heard. And it is about a man who has a dream about a place where you can go, which is essentially dignitas. You know, you can choose to go and die because you don't want to carry on living anymore, or it's the fear of death is so huge that you want to take it away from your life. And so the whole dream goes on and goes on and goes on, and there is the point about which, and this is awfully prescient, and this was not a story that I knew until relatively recently, and it's a lovely person who shows him around this psychiatric place. It's all beautiful, and everywhere he goes, people are playing cards, or someone is having a nice old chat, and there's a lovely atmosphere. It's, you know, the mythology of the good death, if you like. And then towards the end he says, you come into this room, and, oh, is this where it happens? Yes, what happens? We put gas in the room. And you think, good grief, that story was written in 1809 or 90, you know, very close to when his fears of his own madness and the syphilis was eating him away. But so for me, there are such distinct strands of excellence in his writing that just bear revisiting and revisiting. And as a novelist, the only thing that you really want to know is that when you're writing a book, you do the very best you can for the writer that you are at this time with the story you're trying to tell. You can't ask any more of that. But beyond that, the idea that it will have a layer and a depth and will be both of its time but will be sufficient to stand outside it. And so for me, Maupassant is the most extraordinarily modern writer who is utterly of his time. He's utterly fin de siècle. He's utterly everything about Paris, about the Rouen countryside, about the bourgeoisie, about hypocrisy, all of those things. But yet you read him today on a wet July day. He died on the 6th of July, actually. So I felt we were only a day out. And still it has something fresh to say to modern readers. And that is what a great writer is.
Well, I thought, you know, with the news headlines over the last week, I did think that Georges Duroy could have edited the News of the World. I mean, it's an incredibly amoral character.
Yes.
And these remind me also of characters like Becky Sharp in an odd way. And some people would say, oh, he's cynical. He's a very cynical writer. But do you think that really he just had this eye that could get to the core of human nature?
I think it's very hard to discuss whether Maupassant is or isn't cynical without seeing him within the context of that particular period of French culture. And my knowledge of that period, I came to it more through music than I did through literature. And it's very hard it's a mistake, maybe, would be better to say, to underestimate the effect of the Franco-Prussian War on what then happened over those next 30, 40 years leading up to the outbreak of the First World War. What I mean by that is this, that there was a sense of real shame about Prussians in the Champs-Élysées. There was a sense of real shame, and what's the point of it all, with the Commune, the failure of hope that represented, and the extraordinary brutality with which the Commune fell. And there was then a generation of young men who no longer could buy into the glory of war because they'd seen the effects of it. There was an enormous, the final separation of church and state was not to come until the beginning of the 20th century, but the battles over that and the fallow law and all of these things were happening all of the time. There was a group of artists, musicians, painters, obviously people like Debussy, the young guard taking over from the old guard, the academy being challenged from within by some of these young Turks who were quite genuinely supporting, I suppose, the idea of what is the point of politics, of morality, of nationhood. We will live for a pleasure principle. And of course, this is a very small number of elite young men in Paris. And of course, a lot of the relationship at that stage was with Paris and St. Petersburg rather than Paris and London. But it did oddly lead to, one, the most extraordinary flowering of culture. But it also led to the sense of everything should be looked upon with a cold eye, that hypocrisy is the enemy.
Yeah.
The bourgeoisie who say one thing and behave in another way are the enemy. The generals who led us up a blind alley and then left us there. So I would say that within that context, you look at a writer like Huysmans, the very famous novel Against Nature. And I would say that that is cynical and amoral in many ways. And each chapter is essentially devoted to a sense. So it could be sort of smell or whatever. You look at Baudelaire, possibly. You look at many of those writers, and they were living extraordinary personal lives, but they were writing a certain sort of literature, which I would say was cynical. For me, Maupassant is not cynical. Georges is cynical. He is a man on the make. He uses everybody he can and gets what he can and just climbs the ladder and climbs the ladder. And, you know, some of the greatest scenes in the book are those images of, you know, the poor women that have been cast off and him in the cathedral and all of these things. But that's not Maupassant. That is that character, and he is putting that person on a stage and I would say, saying, this is a bad person. This is an amoral person. So for me, it's not a charge that I would hold with, I suppose.
And location's very important in his novels. And his short stories are very, very vivid, whether it's the moonlit Normandy countryside or fin de siècle France, Paris, sorry. I wondered, in terms of being a novelist, how important is location to you, and really getting sort of creating a character out of the setting?
Yes, I think you know, greater minds than I have analysed the role of landscape in Maupassant, but I would say absolutely that in the stories set in Paris, whether it's the country people who flee to Paris or the ones that are set in the sewer life, as someone once called it, Paris is a clear and vibrant and vivid character. And certainly the sort of the rather louche life along the banks of the Seine, the river life, and of course the Normandy, sort of the Normandy countryside, those sorts of woods, the lakes. He is extraordinarily good at summoning up an entire landscape with a turn of a phrase. 3 or 4 words. I mean, God, would that we could all do that. It is absolutely. And when I was writing Sepulchre, which is the middle book of my Languedoc trilogy, which goes from 1891 to 1897 in the historical period. There's also a modern period as well. When I was preparing to write the historical sections, I read Maupassant over and over and over again, because that's where you pick up things such as the way that a lamp steams on a carriage, because it's just been lit and the metal's a bit wet, or what somebody might have for supper. And all of that is set within the context of the landscape. So with Deux Amis, when they go out, it's all about the cold, this extraordinary bone-numbing cold. Another one of my rather favourite stories, I wouldn't say it's one of the greatest of the stories, Femme Fatale, which is essentially a lesbian story. Another sign of his extraordinary modernity in a way, where there is, there's lots of descriptions of this rather thin, doting chap and this rather mouse-like woman, and she seems very quiet, and everybody's always saying, look at them, they're so in love, all these sorts of things, and it's all set around river life and river cafe and culture. And it's not as, there are some of those river stories that are very much set in the underworld of it, if you like, where all the women are prostitutes and all the men are younger sons who've come to squander the family fortune. But this one, they appear to be respectable, shall we say. And then this barge of 3 women or is it 4 women? I can't remember. Sort of just comes into view, and 4, of course. 2 of the women are dressed in men's clothes in a sort of Radcliffe Hall type way, and the 2 of the women are sort of just reclining like this. And then this tiny little woman turns into, she's described as a shrew, and it's because the man says you can't go near them because he's very threatened by them, but the young woman goes Pauline, and off they go. But the reason the story is so wonderful is not just because it's a bizarrely suddenly a lesbian story that you're not quite expecting, and a very erotic one, because we haven't touched on that side of things yet.
No.
But the river and the light. Everything is done. If you look through that story, there are about 10 lines of description, but yet you know everything about what that landscape looks like.
It's like looking at a painting when you're reading that story, isn't it? You feel like you are actually in the moment from the very opening paragraph as he sort of sets the scene for the young couple. It might be a good idea now maybe to have read a passage from Sepulchre, because as we've mentioned it, and the influence of Maupassant there. Would you like to?
Yes, no, I will. I mean, we weren't quite sure how to do this, because it's an odd thing to read another author's work. Now, obviously, he can't read for himself, but nonetheless, it's a strange thing. But one of the questions, in a way, we started, and I'm aware that I haven't quite answered it, is the influence that any particular writer might have on another one. And of course, Maupassant was within an environment where he was being very much supported by Flaubert, but also that, he saved Swinburne, would you believe, from drowning. And, he was given this shriveled hand. So writers do obviously influence each other, either actually in real life by being a patron or a supporter or a help, or because you read and you admire and you follow in. And so I thought that I would read, because I imagine most people here have read some Maupassant, otherwise you wouldn't be here. I was just going to read a couple of paragraphs at the beginning of Sepulchre, just to show, I think, quite how important Maupassant was to me when I was writing this book. And I'm going to have to hold it over here, because inexplicably my arms have got shorter in recent years. So. Wednesday, the 25th of March, 1891. This story begins in a city of bones, in the alleyways of the dead, in the silent boulevard, promenade and impasse of the Cimetière de Montmartre in Paris, a place inhabited by tombs and stone angels and the loitering ghosts of those forgotten before they are even cold in their graves. This story begins with the watchers at the gates, with the poor and the desperate of Paris who have come to profit from another's loss. The gawping beggars and sharp-eyed chiffonniers, the wreath-makers and peddlers of ex-voto trinkets, the girls twisting paper flowers, the carriages waiting with black hoods and smeared glass. This story begins with the pantomime of a burial. A small paid notice in Le Figaro advertised the place and the date and the hour, although few have come. It's a sparse crowd, dark veils and morning coats, polished boots and extravagant umbrellas to shelter from the unseasonable March rain. So you can see, yes, obviously, that that sense of place. And of course, there is a wonderful story, Les Tombales, set in Montmartre. The wonderful story. You see, that's where I would say one of Maupassant's fabulous women characters, where she is pretending to be a grieving widow. She sees a rather, tasty-looking chap on the next door grave. She thinks, I'll have a go at him. They have a bit of an affair. He goes off her. And then he goes again to visit his wife's grave a little below, and he sees her doing the same thing again. And in that story, it's, okay, we both know what we're at. And so for me, that, that sort of sense of the texture of Maupassant, I felt when I was writing Sepulchre, was always at the back of my mind, because although I read many, reread Zola and much of the poetry, and particularly Mallarmé, because Debussy is a character in the novel, and Debussy and Mallarmé worked. A lot of artists worked very closely with each other, poets and composers at that time. At the same time, it always came back to Maupassant in the end.
You mentioned earlier about the eroticism of quite a lot of his stories. One of the stories that makes me laugh whenever I read it is A Parisian Affair, about this sort of celebrity-obsessed woman who goes to town and alights on this rather ugly-looking novelist, but because he's famous, so she sort of throws herself at him. I mean, how do you feel about his eroticism? Because we have the famous Bad Sex Awards over here. I think he seems to be a very good writer about that.
I think, yes, I think that actually he holds back, as it were, actually ever writing about sex. He writes, I think, many erotic passages, but almost always will stop and then take up again. Sex in Maupassant is a difficult and a nasty business a lot of the time. It is a trade. There is a level of contempt for the men who pretend to be virtuously married and visit prostitutes all the time, and also the fact that there's a wonderful line in Boule de Suif where it says quite clearly that legalized prostitution looks down on its sort of freer neighbor. I can't remember the exact phrase, but so it's always a trade, and it's often very clear that the men are simply carried away. They are led not by their minds, shall we say, and then they go off people very, very quickly, and that the women are sort of very, in a way, more judgmental of other women. So the thing that is extraordinarily painful in Boule de Suif, I would say, is that the horrible way, obviously, in which she is generous and lovely, shares her food. She has a particular morality, which Maupassant clearly feels that she is the most moral of them, and indeed the Republican. They are the two in the carriage of the 10 that he admires most, I would suggest, in that story. That they then encourage her to prostitute herself. And when she's done it, they all turn her back on her.
I find the nuns in that story rather interesting, because they eat her food. They eventually persuade her to take up with the Prussian officer, but he's not as condemning of them as he is of the other characters in there. But they seem to be.
Do you not think so? Because I think he talks quite a lot about them. Having this sort of that they are certain sort of women. A sort of sourness and dryness to them of women who live, under complete submission, if you like. So I think the nuns are really sinister.
I think they're sinister. I do think they are sinister in the way that they hide in a corner and they sort of participate.
The black crows, absolutely. I mean, I think the thing about there are two things about sex within Maupassant. There is the issue of it always being a trade, and this is where I would say there is an even-handedness, that I think he is often misanthropic and shows great contempt for both men and women who are engaged in this trade. On the other hand, I think that there is a great deal of real desire for a happy ever after. There are a lot of the latest stories that are about the real need to find proper love and the regret at the desire for the exquisite pain, as he would say, and the regret when it can't last, and there's the sense of seeing the characters that do have everlasting. That there are not many healthy long-term relationships in Maupassant, but when they appear, they are very touching. And I also think that there is this wonderful thing that you could use him to advertise the railways. That he clearly feels that sex on the move is the way to do it. That you've got a much better chance of things being all right if you are in a carriage in the Bois de Boulogne, or if you're on a train. There's an awful lot of that. That sense of the illicit moment. And I think that's where the eroticism comes in, because the minute it becomes part of a relationship, a bargain, it becomes corrupted. And sometimes a woman who has sex for money is very applauded by him, and other times he's not. But if you look at the way that he describes the men, he is more contemptuous often of the men than the women. So he talks a lot about poverty ruining women's looks, but he also talks about how wealth ruins men's looks. So I have a feeling that he might have been someone who did worry about his own weight, because he often, if he wants to tell you that a man is not really much, he will talk about him having a paunch or a jowl, and he makes a lot of physical references so that you can see the marks of sex and overindulgence on everybody. And of course, you know, we know that he had syphilis and was, and it's a long, slow death.
He was an incredible hedonist.
Yes.
I mean, now he would be, I don't know.
Well, I think his parents were, his mum would have been arrested. As far as I could see, he seems to have contracted syphilis when he was about 14. So I think he would have been in care by now. But, I mean, the point is about the sex fit is that it is a great skill to be erotic without taking you into the bedroom. And so the story that I mentioned earlier, there's a femme fatale, the lesbians, or one of the lesbians, you know, there are quite a few lesbians, actually, that pop up from time to time, as it were. That description of those women in the boat is really pretty, you know, blimey. You know, so, you know, and I think that is quite important, because you have to understand why people will risk everything. But again, back to the context, there were many, many, many collections of erotic French short stories in that period of time. And it was part of this liberation. We were getting to the period of time where you had all of these strange groups, whether it was the Golden Dawn, the Mesmerists. There were a lot of groups where essentially men and women were meeting on equal terms, was the story. And therefore, there was quite a lot of publishing of pornography, really, that was getting into the mainstream. And this is why, of course, many of those writers were always being done up for offences against public morals. And, you know, Zola was always being brought to book, and obviously Baudelaire was, you know, never out of trouble. And so, again, within its context, he was quite restrained, I would say.
One of the things we've not talked about is his ghost stories, and we're going through a second sort of wave of ghost stories. You've written novels, Sepulchre and The Winter Ghosts, clearly, with very much ghost stories. Yes. Why are writers continually drawn to ghost stories?
I think in the case of Maupassant, as opposed to the case of my own writing, I don't really think of them as ghost stories, I would say. I see them as supernatural stories which are allied to the sense of the fear of madness, the growing sense of madness, the sense of what is real and what is not real. You know, some of the discussions, the things you read about Maupassant at the very end of his life, you know, this awful sense at one point he was talking, I think in a letter to a friend, about being absolutely sure that his brain was coming out of his nose, and that's always stuck with me. So I don't really see La Roula as a ghost story, actually. I see it as a story of madness. And in a way, if you think, I would say one of the greatest of all, possibly the greatest ghost story, for me would be Henry James' Turn of the Screw. But still, the verdict is out on that. I think that was 1897, so a tiny bit after Maupassant had died. Is it the fevered imagination of the governess, or are there ghosts? So I would say he belongs in that tradition, and certainly I would say that you can very much see Poe's influence in those stories. He was, obviously Poe was leading a rather miserable and depressing life most of the time, but he was enormously admired in France. And the story goes, you know, I don't actually know if this is true or not, but the story goes that Baudelaire learnt English simply to be able to translate Poe. And so that was the influence very strongly there, and I think that he belongs in that tradition. To answer your question about modern day ghost stories, I think that there is, strangely, there was a lot of millennial stuff in the 1990s, in the same way that there was the fin de siècle, obviously, in the 1890s, people looking for signs, all of these sort of slightly febrile atmosphere that there was all of the time. But the millennial stuff for us in our time was very much more to do with science fiction. It was very much more, you know, for me, this is my interpretation, it was much more, are we going to blow ourselves up? Is it going to be the end of the world? You know, the rapture, all of, you know, alternative worlds, dystopic visions, rather than a sort of more internal, which I would say the fin de siècle more was, and more cultural. And oddly, I think we have got to that place 10 years later, strangely. So that there's more similarities with publishing in 2008, 9, 10, 11 with 1898, 9 than there was 100 years later. And I think the attraction of ghost stories is what we all know to be true. That however much information you have, however much science reveals, there always remains those questions which are somehow just beyond that lovely gap where science or faith or music or literature or love takes you so far, and then there is something else, that inexplicable gap, which takes you somewhere else. And I think that, oddly, as science lays things bare and explains things, there is always that hunger to say, but what about ... And so with ghost stories, they had disappeared because there had been an appetite for horror, which is a completely different sort of a beast, and for science fiction, which is a different sort of a beast. And then little by little, the idea of that puzzle, that sense of, people often say to me, because I have written a couple of ghost stories, do you believe in ghosts? And the answer is, as a writer, I don't know. When I'm sitting here on the stage talking to you, Danuta, and looking out over here, and full expectation that we are in the French Institute, and the glass of wine I will be given in a moment will be delicious. Do I believe in ghosts? No. When I'm walking in a path, in the woods outside Rennes-les-Bains, in the southwest of France, on my own, there is a part of me that feels that if I turned round just a little bit faster than I can ever quite achieve, I would see something. And it's not a fearful thing, but it is a sense of the echo in the landscape. It is a sense of hearing beyond what is possible, seeing beyond what is possible. For some people, they would call that faith. My lovely dad, who has died very recently, would call that faith. He felt quite sure that he would reach a place where he saw something that was ineffable, that wonderful word in Christian hymns, ineffable, beyond explanation. And I think that there is a longing in the modern psychology for something that can't quite be explained away. And that's why I write ghost stories. And people have a different reaction to them. And many of my readers believe absolutely in ghosts and will tell me their stories of having seen them. And others absolutely poo-poo it. But yet, Tracy Chevalier, who I think has done things here, and I know Joanne Harris also, who did one of the French Passions a bit earlier in the series. She said, that's that moment, isn't it, when it's all nonsense, but yet you have to get up to make sure the door is locked. As if that would work.
Just before we open up to questions, we've got time for some questions, but I just wondered, if you were talking to somebody who's never read any Maupassant before, what would you say you have to start with?
Well, I would never say that. I would, however, press the Sean Miles translation of short stories, A Prison Affair and other stories, into somebody's hands, because I think that there is, as I said right at the beginning, I think there is an equanimity in her translations, which for me are more appropriately how I feel Maupassant treated men and women and different sort of characters. And it's very much, it's the same as people, there's a great English short story writer called Algernon Blackwood. I don't know if any of you know him. Everybody, in a way, knows M.R. James. If you talk about ghost stories, Edwardian ghost stories, the chap saying, come close, bring your chair up, I'm going to tell you the story. Everybody knows M.R. James, and others, of that period, But for me, Algernon Blackwood is that person. And people say, well, where should we start? And the truth is, it depends on your taste. So he had many animist stories, which appeal to me enormously because the landscape is alive. There's a wonderful story called The Trees, where there is a husband and wife, very much sort of Maupassant territory. And every day the woman feels just more hemmed in by the trees. And he feels more communing with the trees. And the trees are getting every day a little bit closer to the house. And it's absolutely brilliant and terrifying. But if you're not interested in nature with a capital N, then that story probably won't do it for you. So for me with Maupassant, oddly, I would send them to the stories. We've talked about Belle Amie. Most people, most critics would say that Pierre et Jean is the greatest of the 6 novels. I feel that if you read the novels as short stories, because they are essentially episodic novels, then they work better. I think the short stories are stronger, so I would send them certainly there rather than one of the novels. And I think I would probably send them to the ones where, the gentler ones, because your point was well made about some of the attitudes to women are very grim. And you wouldn't want to send, if you love or admire Maupassant as I do, I wouldn't want to send anyone to Belle Amie to start with, because there is a very pernicious strain of anti-Semitism in that novel, which is about the characters and the period of time, and it's just, really very shortly before the Dreyfus affair is about to explode. And we all know this to be the case. Britain and France in that period of time, the 1890s, it was pretty full on, frankly. But I would hate someone to read that and therefore think, well, therefore he is anti-Semitic and anti-women, because the characters in the, there are very troubling things in those. So I would send him to that collection, or her to that collection of short stories. And I think it's very important when someone is prolific and hardworking as Maupassant was, it might be because he knew that he would have a short creative life, short life altogether. It might just be because that was how he was as a writer. It's hard to, distinguish the two things. But it's okay to start a collection of short stories and go, I don't quite like that one, I'll skip it. You don't have to read every story in order. This is the very important thing. It's different with a novel. So go and press the Sean Miles, or indeed any collection.
Yeah. It's a very, very good translation.
Yes, I think they are. I think they're more Maupassant. That's the issue for me.
Considering it's the centenary of Mervyn Peake's birth.
Yes.
Yes. Have you been influenced by his writing, and what do you think about his ghostwriting?
Well,
any relation, to French literature in him? I've only started reading him and about him.
Well, the question was that it's the centenary of Mervyn Peake's birth, and whether that's been an influence on me as well, and the links between the two. Funnily enough, on the Late Review last week, we were looking at Mervyn Peake. They've just brought out a wonderful new illustrated edition of the Gormenghast trilogy, and with many of his line drawings in, which is exquisite. If you have a spare £30, it comes in quite hefty in all ways. Yes, Peake has been an influence on me, but I didn't realise it. And what I would say about that was that I tried to read Peake when I was too young. With Maupassant, I came to him much later, and so when I started to read him, as I said, I was really probably in my 30s, which is partly why I have this rather ghastly zeal of the, Johnny come lately. You all probably were reading Maupassant when you were 10, but I wasn't, so I have this sort of, with Peake, I tried to read Peake when I was a teenager, and I knew that I was reading a work of genius, but it was over my head. I wasn't capable of understanding it, really. But I knew it mattered, and I kept going back until I suddenly realized, actually, much like Maupassant and his novels, that if I read, Titus Alone and Gormenghast, if I read them as picaresque, episodic scenes, rather than a novel with a linear narrative and characters who would do the right thing. Namely, I would have a proper background to them. I would know who they were, what their job was in the book, and there would be a plot that I could follow. So I then started to read him, but very much in the way of opening up a page and reading that and then putting it down. So rather than reading it as novels, I read Peake as a writer, not a reader. And so, if you open up the first description of his mother, and with this extraordinary sort of all the mice in her hair, and as she moves, all these cats running around her. If you just read that and then shut it, you think, oh my God, that's amazing. So I'm aware that from that, I realised the importance of every tiny scene, however irrelevant to the plot or the story. And I write adventure stories, so the plot is the most important thing. But if every scene shimmers on its own, and if it doesn't, it goes. And that, I think, I got from Peak. And I mostly dislike knowing about an author's life. I prefer to let the text speak for itself. But I found it very interesting when I learnt that Peak had been one of the very first war artists into Belsen. And then I saw the horror of what he'd seen imprinted on his soul as a writer, but very clearly on the page. And that did enhance those pictures for me. And the one last thing on Peak, because obviously we're not, this is a separate thing, but when all the descriptions of Fuchsia, Tycete's sister, I'd read them as she was very dark hair, dark skin. When you see his line drawings, you see that she is African. And I'd never seen that. But when you see those line drawings, you think, oh, had a completely different, because she's always portrayed, particularly on screen, as a very beautiful, very fey, very thin, very white girl with brown hair. But his drawings tell of a strong and different sort of person, and that was very interesting to me. And I think there are similarities in some of the nightmare writing of Maupassant with Peak. I don't know whether Peak would ever have credited Maupassant. I don't know if he read Maupassant at all, because of course he was, to start with, first and foremost an artist, and sometimes you miss out on those texts. But I think they, the two complement each other, no doubt.
Yeah, I just wonder if you've seen the French series Chez Maupassant on TV, and whether it well represents the stories.
Oh, no, I haven't actually. So that's going to be a hopeless answer. I was asked if I'd seen a television series, Chez Maupassant, but I haven't seen it. So I'm afraid I can't help you. Okay. I'm sorry about that.
Another question is that, would you think that Maupassant has a much better sense of humour than Zola, for example?
Oh,
would you regard
yes.
the story about the lady and her... was it diamond necklace, Le Collier?
Necklace, yes.
As a funny story or a sad story?
That is a really good question, because on the one hand, it's tragic. These people ruin themselves, to get the necklace. I think there is more humour in Maupassant than is often talked about, but I think that's because it isn't the most important thing about him, I would say. So I think that story, if I was in a cheery mood, I might very well think that was quite a funny story. In other circumstances, if I'd been reading it after something rather more serious, or all those stories where, women are being very much, knocked about, and, so it's the context for me of those. So when I read it this time, I thought it was quite funny, but I don't think I felt it was funny to start with.
He's quite a wry writer.
Well, it's a wry, and also I think a lot of his humour is in the description, because the truth. I know I keep bringing it back to the charges that are made against Maupassant for being rather misogynistic, but I say this as a feminist. I feel that it's ludicrous, this idea that all women are nice and all men are horrible, or the other way around. The point is that there are lots of really horrible women in his stories and lots of great ones, and the same with the men. But a lot of the descriptions, I think that it's it's that thing that they always say to actors if they're feeling very, very nervous, or they've got to do an interview with somebody and they're intimidated. All you need to do is think of that person with their trousers round their knees, or sort of immediately any sort of pretension is pricked out of them. And I think that what Maupassant does, which is part of his humour for me, is that when he wants you to not really respect somebody, there is a physical description that makes them seem a little bit ridiculous.
It's always telling details.
Yes, and it might be the woman whose corset really has seen better days, or often, as I said, it's the men with their paunches and they're sort of slightly drooling around the side, and and all those sorts of things, and that's a great way of, I think he's very good at keeping out of it. I don't like authorial interference in a story. And I think one of the reasons the stories are so successful is that although, on the one hand, you could say they're all about prostitutes and rich men who can't find anything to do with their money, or need to have more sex than the opportunities there are days of the week. So they should all sound the same, but yet they don't.
No,
and
they
that's partly it. It's that underpinning of humour in some of the descriptions.
Publishers often claim today that short stories don't sell. But you would have thought with the attention span of most people today, they'd be more popular than ever. What was it about the 1890s that made short stories so incredibly popular that you can have specialists like Maupassant?
Magazines. The culture of publishing, and I'm afraid publishers are right, short story collections do not sell. And it's an interesting thing, and your point is well made. I think we might see a resurgence of short stories once ebooks and downloads become a reality, as opposed to just a few people going, my God, everything's changed, because it hasn't. You might find that short stories will come back because people will start to write for the different medium, and that will make a difference to publishers' attitudes to this, but that's a whole other business. In that period of time, in much as we saw in England, obviously, with serialisation, but serialisation was the name of the game. Mass market production of books was starting to happen from the 1850s onwards. Obviously, there'd always been books, but it was becoming much more possible for the ordinary reader to start to buy a paperback. And obviously, in the UK, there was sort of Smith's Travelling Library, and but in the culture was reading stories in newspapers, and they were serialized. And then if there was you could see absolutely, much as you see in Bel Ami, indeed, you write a story. Is the subscription in the newspaper a little bit bigger the next week? Yes, it is, because people want to know what the next bit of the story. And then bit by bit, so you see that sort of sense of episodic, once a week, building up, and then suddenly, bam, you've got a collection. And of course, that's one of the reasons that Maupassant and many others of those short story writers were so prolific, because they had to deliver one a week.
It's been an absolute joy to talk to you, as always. I'm sure everybody's enjoyed hearing what you have to say, and thank you for being a very good audience. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.